agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this week?
I'm cold and windblown right now, and after it's
a Cleveland February kind of thing, certainly.
Yes. So
now I know it's been a rough week for you, and in fact, the passing of someone very important to you and important in politics as well. And so, why don't we start off the show with that?
Yeah, I did, and thank you, Mike. This is what they call in the legislature rising for a point of personal privilege. Last week, Ohio lost former Speaker William G. Batchelder III bill to those who knew him, and the whole. This is kind of goes to my origin story as a defender of freedom. Bill is sort of the reason I'm here, maybe the reason I'm anywhere. He was a mentor to me. I was his legislative aide for 5 years, beginning when we served in the minority, and then when he became Speaker pro tem. And he was the funniest, smartest person I've ever met, a person with the greatest integrity I've ever met. And I know a lot of times, Mike, we bemoan sort of the lack of integrity in public servants and the mixed motives that drive them into this business. But Bill Batchelder was not one of those people. He was in this always for the right reasons, and he did tremendous work. And I just want to share a couple, just the Batchelder sense of humor and the wittiness. Someone shared the other day the story of he returned to the legislature. He had been term limited out and then served as a judge for close to 10 years, but decided he liked the legislature better. So he ran again, and this was in the post 9/11 world. And there were all sorts of new security measures in place, which he never cared for before. There was a first step of security back when we were there after Oklahoma City. His thought was it was an unnecessary burden for people to get in to speak to their representatives, which he thought was really important. He welcomed people coming in, sitting down in the office and talking to him or me on whatever topic was bothering him that day. He also thought that anyone who would seek to assassinate a state representative was seriously lacking in ambition, or his words. But after 9/11, when he returned, beginning early in the session, and I think he was not recognized by one of the security people, and he, of course, was sort of oblivious to them being there because he just sort of blows through things. Security guards ask, he sees him passing through, and they're, sir, stop, please stop. I need to see your ID, sir. And he finally stops. He says, oh, yes. And then the security guy says, well, do you work for the state? And Bill, without missing a beat, says, oh, I know. I work against it. So that sort of gives you the sense of, and I wish I could convey it more. We could do an entire podcast series on Mr. Batchelder, but he was a great man, and he affected so many lives, mine included. And he will be greatly missed by the people who knew him and by the state of Ohio. So I just wanted to get that out there.
All right. Well, we have a lot we're going to get to today. Russia and Ukraine, a bunch of lawsuits, both from the federal government and against the federal government, something about the Durham probe. We haven't talked about that in a while, and a lot more. But before we actually get to that, we will take a quick break, and then we will be right back to start things off. Okay, so we open with the topic we've been discussing a lot on the show of late, Russia's almost but not quite yet invasion of Ukraine. Early this week, it seemed like there was a glimmer of hope as the Kremlin announced they were pulling back some troops from the border. But, well, satellite imagery indicated not only was that untrue, but that Russia actually had moved more troops into the area in the last week. And the Biden administration...
It's almost like you can't trust the Russians.
You know, it is funny, isn't it, that way? Yeah. So, the Biden administration been saying with increasing vehemence that they expect a Russian invasion in the next few days. And they say that Russia is planning on staging a false flag operation to kind of justify that invasion. In fact, on Thursday, we may have seen the beginnings of this with the shelling in eastern Ukraine, including the shelling of a kindergarten, which Ukrainian officials say was conducted by Russian-backed separatists, and Russian media saying, well, no, Ukrainian forces were responsible. And also this week, Russian lawmakers have been encouraging Putin to recognize the eastern Ukrainian cities of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent. So, Jay, I want to get your take on what we've seen with Russia and Ukraine this week, and also what you think about the Biden administration's public comments, which essentially amount to saying, well, Russia's made up its mind. In fact, the president just flat out said that, and not just to invade, but to invade under false pretenses.
So, look, I'm going to give credit where credit's due, and I think the Biden administration is correct in calling this out and saying this is plainly invasion. This is exactly what it looks like. And I think getting the message out there that no, you simply can't trust Vladimir Putin or the Russians, and I fully expect that that's correct. That this is going to be some sort of a false flag, movement that they will need to go in and liberate, Russian citizens or Russian-speaking people from the depredations of the Ukrainians. So, I think he's right on that in terms of what we can do. As we've discussed before, I think our options are limited. I don't think anyone is seriously talking about U.S. military defense of Ukraine or stepping in to counter a Russian invasion. The best we can do, and I wish we'd done more of it earlier, but we are where we are. Is making sure that the Ukrainians have the armament to resist and make Putin pay as high a price militarily as possible, and that we're prepared to move quickly on sanctions so that we can impose some sort of economic cost on him as well. And again, I don't think that either of those two pieces changes the situation. I don't think that changes his calculus in terms of invading. But perhaps it raises the cost to him, and we can sort of beef up the other NATO allies in Eastern Europe to make sure that he gets the message that he best not stray any farther than Ukraine.
Well, and what do you think about just the actual sort of, I guess you could call it the PR strategy from at least the public statement strategy from the Biden administration? Because, of course, typically what we see before there are some hostilities is the public statements are, well, we're hoping this doesn't happen, and we want to give peace a chance and all this sort of stuff. And so this is very much like, no, this is almost certainly going to happen. This is something we in fact rarely see. I can't really recall this happening. And it's a very different sort of way of approaching it. And so, but it sounds like you actually approve of this approach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is this is a little bit of a weird situation in that I'm trying to think historically if there's any precedent that we've ever really seen where, countries are so loudly and forcefully announcing, hey, we're getting ready to invade. If you think back to World War II, there was certainly some of this, but we didn't have the type of intelligence we do now, and satellite imagery and being able to view where the troops are going and amassing in real time. And I think that's a difference, right? That it's surprise attacks like you used to have just are much harder, if not impossible, to come by. So I think that's part of it, right? We're in a weird situation where everyone knows this is coming, and there isn't any sort of surprise or the sense of, well, maybe we can avert it. Yeah, certainly countries always give lip service to peace and let's keep negotiating and all that sort of thing. And I think the Biden administration has said some of the right things about, listen, this doesn't have to happen. But the ball is in Putin's court, and we've sort of reached the end of our negotiating, and we have every reason to believe he's going to move forward and invade. And I think that's very helpful, right, in terms of just setting out the truth of this, sort of the opposite of a Munich moment, right?
Right.
Let's not pretend that we're somehow going to have peace here. Now, in fairness, to Chamberlain, I mean, I think he really believed he was going to have peace. But I think just we're not in that place. No one believes it. And I don't think diplomacy. There's always some disingenuousness, right, in diplomacy. And it serves a purpose to a point, but I think there also reaches a point where that disingenuousness just makes everybody look silly and makes us look like we lack resolve or lack the basic understanding of what's going on. So I mean, there's lots of stuff I complain about the Biden administration all the time, but I think they're at this point that is the right move, is saying, we believe they're going to do it, and if they do, the cost is going to be severe. Now, again, I might be more direct to say, here will be the cost. Here are the sanctions. Here's the package. We're voting on it. We have the votes. That sort of thing. But in the general messaging of like pretending that there will be a diplomatic solution, I think this is correct.
You and I, of course, are both kind of old Cold Warriors, but I thought for a different perspective, we could try to consider this more from the America First sort of perspective, because it seems to me that the non-interventionist argument or the non-Ukraine support argument seems to me that essentially, of course, we don't have a defense treaty with Ukraine. It's not a NATO member. And so we shouldn't be wasting resources in its defense or even get involved in any sort of funding, covert or overt, of resistance forces or Ukrainian government forces right after an invasion. And that this is essentially a European problem, and we should let Europe deal with it, particularly Germany, which, Germany has made a decision to move away from nuclear power almost entirely. And because of that, it knows the consequences of that. And it's made itself even more reliant on on Russian energy. And, Germany has the fourth largest economy in the world, and as such, Germany should be leading the push for European security and doing way more than it is for the defense of democracy in Europe. I mean, Germany's not even willing to put up its 2% of GDP for NATO support, and that's the ostensible guideline. So why should we bail out Germany, bail out Europe when they're not willing to defend themselves, and when they certainly have the economic means to do so? Isn't it time to stop the free riding and say these are the consequences? If you're concerned with the defense of Europe and Russian aggression in your backyard, don't look to us, look to yourselves.
Well, I guess I'd point out the obvious sort of historical precedent that German-Russian partnerships rarely end well for anybody.
Yeah, but is that fair? I mean, we're looking at very different governments, very different periods. So
I think it is a little bit. I think
it's like so. I don't think so. No,
because you're obviously there's the argument, and I argue this all the time, and I think it's absolutely correct that Hitler and Nazi Germany were something apart from anything else the world had ever seen. Right? It's sui generis, and to say, every German government is Hitler, or every dictator is Hitler, is nonsense. But I do think there are long-term geopolitical strategic factors that don't change, right, and that haven't changed for centuries. and that is there's always been this tension, right? And Germany is sort of the bulwark of Western Europe, and Russia, which has always had this sort of expanding and receding pull in Eastern Europe, and I think that existed, under Bismarck and before Hitler, and I think those forces are still at play, even though the players are different. That both the Germans and the Russians distrust each other, both seek to expand their sphere of influence, or if you want to call it a buffer zone between the other. I think that's just one of those geopolitical facts, and that plays into it. Yeah,
but of course, Germany is a democracy, a real democracy, and has been one for a long, long time, whereas Russia is an authoritarian state. And so, I'm all for Germany expanding the influence of democracy, just like I am for the U.S. doing it in our sphere of influence, which would be, the Americas. And so that's the argument, I think. And I think there's something to be said for that argument. And so do you disagree? Do you think that Germany should be doing more?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. But the problem is they're not, and they don't seem inclined to.
Well, that's my point, right? And that's the point
it seems that the Germans may look at this as, again, very much the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And again, I understand that the players are different here. But the sense, back then was, hey, you guys go ahead and take Poland, and we're okay with it, and we won't bug you, and you won't bug us. I think there is sort of a sense of, look, Russia, if you want to take Ukraine, as long as you're still providing us with the natural gas we want, we're not gonna cause much of a fuss over it.
Yeah. Okay. And so you say that the United States should be willing to bear any burden, fight any battle in the defense of, Ukrainian freedom.
Oh, I don't know about bear any burden, fight any battle, right? And I don't think there's anyone out there seriously suggesting that this would be U.S. Suggesting U.S. intervention or war with Russia, or anything akin to pushing Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait or something like that. I think we ought to be look at what our national interest is, whether we have the wherewithal to fight a war, and a continued war, and a possible continued occupation against a Russian military that is, I wouldn't say is no longer a superpower, but not necessarily a pushover.
Definitely not
for territory that we don't have much of a sphere of influence type claim to.
You can claim
we don't have an alliance with. We're not obligated to, but I think we should still do everything we can up to that point in terms of leadership in the international community. And whatever we can do unilaterally in terms of supplying arms and making the cost of an invasion as high as possible to Putin.
Okay. And, we've talked in the past about the wider ramifications, like, for instance, with China and Taiwan. And there's been talk that, Putin was emboldened to do this thing, which I'm betting by the time a lot of listeners hear it will already been a done thing. The invasion will have happened, but in part because of what he saw from Afghanistan, right? The pullout in Afghanistan, and so there are people saying, well, then China's looking at this, and they might be thinking, hey, what's the U.S. going to do if we decide we want to take over Taiwan in a very real way? And I wanted to look at that as well. What could the U.S. really do to stop a Chinese takeover of Taiwan if they chose to eventually invade? And, this is, again, going back to this sort of America first, semi-isolationist view, saying that, well, wouldn't we be better served to just let China deal with China's own sphere of influence? And, we haven't recognized Taiwan as a country for over 40 years.
50 years, probably,
and you could also make the argument that a less aggressive military posture right in China's backyard could potentially lessen tensions and give us maybe some leverage to use that in coming to agreements over things that are clearly hugely important to Americans, to America, like intellectual property and trade issues and that sort of thing. And, people say, well, if you think about the shoe being on the other foot, if China had a significant military presence in, right off the Atlantic coast or right in our backyard, that would cause us some problems as well. So, and I think I'm not necessarily saying I entirely agree with this argument, but I think that there are points that are being made here that are at least worth considering.
So I've considered them.
Okay.
And I guess, I think so often the whole foreign policy thinking and foreign policy establishment, and I don't know, maybe I'm using that incorrectly, because in this case, the establishment would seem to be more of along my line, I think. But so many folks treat international relations as they would interpersonal relations. That, hey, look, China, we'll be cool with you, and you be cool with us, and it's all good. And hey, if you want to invade Taiwan, we're not going to cause much of a fuss. And hey, maybe then you could cut us a break and stop stealing our intellectual property. I don't think that argument is going to fly with Xi or the Chinese government at large. But the sense is, when you're dealing with those types of persons and or countries, that interpersonal piece just doesn't matter. I mean, that was a mistake I think Donald Trump made, right? He believed in his personal charm, and hey, I'll talk to this guy and we can make a deal, and I can talk to anybody and make a deal. And even George W. Bush had the same sort of, I've looked into Putin's eyes and, this sort of thing. But states don't act like people do. And even more so, dictators don't act like the people in your office or someone that
right?
your neighbors are having some interpersonal issue with. And I think it's really naive to think that. I think if we were to do that, China would say, okay, we'll take Taiwan, and yes, we'll keep taking your intellectual property too. And you might say, well, geez, that's not fair. Come on, man, we just let you take Taiwan. And they would say, well, yes, we're taking your intellectual property too. And, Japan's looking kind of nice also. And
so that's kind of at the heart of the Cold Warrior argument, if you will, and that's certainly the position where I tend to fall more clearly, like you do, in that what authoritarian, and I think it's an important point to make, what authoritarian regimes respect is power, and what they will exploit is what they see as weakness. And so we have to make a distinction if we're dealing with a truly democratic regime as opposed to an authoritarian regime. And of course, in the case of both Russia and China, we're dealing with authoritarian regimes. And that I think, that's why, I agree with you. I think it's important to understand the America First sort of isolationist viewpoint, but I think it falls apart exactly where you say it does, in the fact that we're not dealing with democracies that are responsive to popular rule and popular will. We're dealing with a very different type of setup, and so therefore the same rules that we would use if we're dealing with Canada or Germany or something like that, they just don't apply. It's not going to be very effective.
Yeah, and I would also put in a pitch here for American exceptionalism, because I think this is a place where it shows up, in that there have been conflicts that we were involved in throughout recent history. I'm thinking, for example, Serbia in the 90s and Somalia in the 90s, where our national interest was really pretty limited and really pretty hard to define. Serbia, I would say, bigger national interest, because it was causing a big problem for Europe in terms of refugees, and the sense that, originally there was this is a European problem, they can take care of it themselves, but they didn't, and they don't. They tend not to. The same goes with the Congo, or with Somalia. There was very much a humanitarian crisis going on there, and we looked at this, and as a superpower, as the American people look at this and say, no, we can't countenance genocide when we may have the power to stop it. And I think that's something different. I do think that the United States, while it has this protectionist Fortress America type isolationist instinct, at the same time also has this let's call it evangelical for freedom, right? That there's the idea that we ought to spread freedom and defend freedom around the world that other countries just don't have. I don't think there was a debate in Germany or France about, geez, should we really intervene in Somalia? There didn't seem to be much of a debate in Germany and France about what to do about Serbia back in the day, the Serbian-Bosnian conflict. So I think that is America's just different. I mean, I think just because of ideologically, temperamentally, the fact that we are a superpower, that we view these things a little differently than other countries.
Well, I think next week, Jay, you and I will be doing the show next week, and I expect that we will be at that point talking about what exactly we will be doing to respond to the Russian invasion that has happened. But
not particularly you and me respond to the Russian invasion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we will express outrage and so forth, but it's probably not going to do a whole lot for Putin. Exactly. So yeah. All right. Let's move on. Before we do that, we will take a quick break, and then we will be right back. This week, the Department of Justice sued the state of Missouri over that state's Second Amendment Preservation Act, which, to quote from the legislation, declares as invalid all federal laws that infringe on the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and Article 1, Section 23 of the Missouri Constitution. Now, under the Act, not only are Missouri law enforcement officers prohibited from enforcing federal firearms laws that Missouri has declared unconstitutional, but they can be subject to up to a $50,000 civil penalty for enforcing federal firearms laws, as well as attorney's fees added on to that. Now, the DOJ alleges that Missouri's law is, in effect, a nullification of federal law, and as such, it violates the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, citing a line of precedents going, well, all the way back to McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, in which Chief Justice Marshall, writing for a unanimous court, held that, in Marshall's words, states have no power, by taxation or otherwise, to retard, impede, burden, or in any matter control the operations of the constitutional laws enacted by Congress to carry into execution the powers vested in the general government. This is, we think, the unavoidable consequence of that supremacy which the Constitution has declared. So, Jay, what's your take on Missouri's law and this lawsuit?
Well, I think John Marshall's right.
That's generally a good bet, right? Yeah.
We touched on this before, and these sort of things trouble me. I think it's just, again, I put this in the category of just plain goofy. I think there could be, and a weird thing, there could be, I think, Missouri could do through its own state constitution, enforcement of whatever protections it has under that affords firearms greater state constitutional protections than what the Second Amendment does. But no, there is quite a long precedent about whether states can nullify federal acts, and they can't. And we fought a war over this. And there, I mean, I think there's whole, from a theoretical standpoint, the whole fascinating bit of you get into the roots of the nullification theory that arise from it was the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, written by Jefferson and Madison, respectively, where they took aim at the Alien Sedition Acts, saying that look, these acts are unconstitutional on their face, and this is before so the Supreme Court had gotten into the business of saying what was unconstitutional and what wasn't. But states should feel free to ignore them, nullify them. That was picked up later by opponents of the National Bank and some tariffs and John C. Calhoun and the 1830s, and then that same argument was then, of course, carried into the slavery debate. But that's sort of, again, I think it's all fascinating history, but it's pretty plain and it's pretty well decided that the supremacy clause means what it says, and states cannot nullify federal laws.
Yeah, and that point you mentioned about Missouri could do some things to enhance firearm protection. Now, obviously, because of the supremacy clause, they can't flat out declare federal law invalid in Missouri. But one thing I was thinking that they could do that might be okay constitutionally is make the case that Missouri can, for instance, instruct state law enforcement agencies that they don't have to assist the federal government in enforcing federal firearms laws.
Yeah, and that's the same thing that sanctuary cities and so forth have done. There's no requirement, and in fact, it would be a constitutional violation for the federal government to enlist state authorities to do that. But they could opt out. They could, and again, I would think so many of these federal crimes would probably be crossover between state crimes anyway, right? Yeah. So I think the rarity that you'd have would be things like background checking and licensing and those types of things that are clearly preempted by federal law. Other things Missouri could do is say, listen, if someone violates someone's Second Amendment rights or whatever the corollary rights under the Missouri Constitution are, we can provide for a suit, and you can have punitive damages, liquidated damages, whatever, and increase a penalty on people who violate those rights. But I don't think you can, under any circumstances, just say we're going to declare the federal law invalid.
Yeah. And this, you called it a goofy, right? Because it's just so clearly there aren't too many things we run across that are as clearly unconstitutional with as strong a line of precedent as this is, right? But this wasn't something that just kind of squeaked through. I mean, this law passed in the Missouri House 103-43 and 22-10 in the state Senate. The governor, happily signed it into law. So I think it's fair to call you a constitutional conservative. What does it say to you that the Republican Party in Missouri was thrilled to basically nullify the Constitution? What's your takeaway from that?
Well, my guess is that this is one of those situations where you can sort of sound really tough while avoiding any sort of actual accountability, because everyone knows that you're not actually nullifying nullifying federal law, and that you can't, right? So it's sort of an easy vote to say, hell yeah, I'm, and it's more just a now, of course, if they want to do this the constitutional way, they could have passed some sort of legislative resolution saying we find these, federal laws to be odious and, that kind of thing, which would have accomplished the same purpose. But, it'll allow these folks to go and beat their chests and say, look at me, I'm standing up to the federal government. And if it wasn't for those weak-kneed, wishy-washy courts, we'd be fine. So, yeah, I mean, I don't care for that sort of legislation at all. But I understand the political reasoning behind it. Because no one's going to take them to task for saying this is clearly goofy and unconstitutional.
Right. And that's what I'm wondering, because some people would say, well, isn't this a frivolous thing that wastes the considerable resources of the court system? And isn't it basically misusing, in a way, sort of taxpayer dollars and the resources of the system to make some sort of a symbolic point?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
But, look, I think I wouldn't say waste, because to some extent, legislatures, that's sometimes what they do, is make symbolic points, and to some it may be frivolous, and others it may not. And I'm not necessarily opposed to symbolic points. For example, where I live, a couple years back, the Lakewood City Council passed a resolution opposing the Citizens United decision, with all the wording of this is a horrible affront to our Constitution and so forth, which I thought was stupid and goofy and a waste of time. And I was right on all of those. But I mean, I think it's one of those. It happens, right? And I guess sometimes elected officials feel that need to put themselves on the record,
right,
on a certain issue.
But would you say here's what I'm getting at. Would you say there's a difference between passing a resolution, which is not the sort of thing that's judicially challengeable or anything like that, and given it, and something that says, well, we are going to pretend that we have the authority to do this, which suggests, I mean, there are legitimacy issues here involved, because there are plenty of people who would say, yes, you should do that, and the hell with the Constitution, we should be able to know. So I'm saying there are potentially ramifications here that there aren't for, say, like you suggested, passing a resolution. Yeah, no, I agree. Although I think the ramifications are not going to be that great, right? I think it's going to go to court, and the court will say, look, I mean, assuming it actually gets, well, I mean, I guess it's in court already since the federal government sued. But the federal government will get a declaratory judgment saying, hey, Missouri, you can't do this because supremacy clause. And they'll probably appeal that. And you'll get a fairly, short opinion there also. And does the Supreme Court end up taking this case? I very much doubt it. So it's basically just like a pretty simple, a nice sort of breather for the federal judges who have to deal with, like, oh, this is an easy one. We can just kind of.
Yes. No, I mean, seriously, when I was a clerk, yes, you kind of love those cases, right?
Kind of give the clerk some experience. Say, why don't you just write the draft of this one? Go ahead and get your feet wet on this really simple one.
You lose. See Maryland versus McCullough.
There you go. Okay.
I think it's and look. I mean, to some extent, there are probably some federal judges who would get a kick out of. They can write a great big stem winding opinion. Sure. And citing all sorts of history and saying, no, you idiots, this is entirely. So is there a expenditure of legislative and judicial resources that might better be expended elsewhere? Sure, but it certainly wouldn't be the first time that. And you have to look at the way our system is set up. We're not supposed to be efficient.
Well, that's good. That works out well.
I know. I think there's a certain point to. Look, if they want to, if the people want to vent on this, they can do so, and I think that's healthy for democracy, and maybe it's a healthy learning curve for folks when they get the opinion back that says no. Look, we've been telling you since 1819 you can't do this.
Except my sense
I don't see it. Look, I mean, is it a waste? Sure, but there are plenty of cases out there that you might say are a waste of judicial resources that either are pretty clear cut to begin with, or probably could have gotten resolved earlier. But that's what the court's there for, right?
My sense is that it's not really a healthy learning curve, because to plenty of people, it's not going to be, oh, the court said that we can't do this. I didn't realize that. Good to know. It'd be more, well, these corrupt courts that want to trample your rights, and so we need to do something about that. So that's my concern about something like this, as opposed to a resolution.
Yeah, no, and I can see that, but.
Okay, well, if you are a Politics Guys supporter, the rest of the episode is coming right up. And if you're not, just a quick reminder that full episodes, which are ad-free and run around 2 hours or so, are available to our Patreon supporters, as well as to anyone who isn't in a position to financially support the podcast, or if you just like to try out the full show before becoming a supporter. To do that, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo. We're at Politics Guys, as well as through PayPal. You can find support links in our show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. And again, if you would like access to full episodes, but you are not in a position to support us financially, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get that all set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, if you could subscribe, rate the show, leave reviews on whatever podcast app you use, that would really be helpful, as would be sharing episodes on social media. Thanks so much.